Luigi, I want to start where the two of us began. It was about 2 years ago. I came to your office at the Global Crop Diversity Trust, which at that time was housed at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in Rome. And I came to meet you to learn more about seeds for a book that I was writing. And I mentioned at that time that my book editor was worried that seeds weren't sexy enough as a topic, and you very directly reminded me that seeds are sex. So I have, of course, repeated that story multiple times, but I share it here because I think it's a critical foundation for any inquiry on biodiversity. Most people have a sense of this loss of connectedness to our natural resources, and I believe, however, that they have lost that connection to the buried foundations of food and fuel and fiber and medicine. Can you please talk a bit about the Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture and how the Trust and the Svalbard Global Seed Vault were developed?
Sure. And it's nice to see you again. The treaty came out of the recognition that we are all incredibly interconnected, as far as, well, in many ways, but in terms of our food. The wheat that makes bread in, let's say, Mexico, originally came from the Middle East. The cassava that feeds people in Ghana and in Kenya came from South America. And you can repeat such stories for most of the crops that we use around the world. And not only are we interconnected in the sense that crops that came from one place are grown in another and eaten in another, the diversity that we need to improve those crops is also found everywhere where that crop is grown. And it was recognized that unless there was continued access to that diversity to farmers and breeders, we weren't going to be able to cope with the changes in market preferences and people's predilection for different kinds of apples, let's say, or oranges. And also, breeders we're not going to be able to improve the crops and make them resist climate change and other challenges that are coming our way. And that's why the sort of agricultural research community, the ministries of agriculture of the countries of the world, got together and said, well, how can we ensure that we are able to continue to improve our crops into the future, and how can we make sure that farmers 100, 200, 300 years from now are still going to be able to have access to all the diversity that they have access to now, and maybe some of which has been lost. So they came together, and over 7 or 8 years of negotiations, they put together this new treaty, which sets out first of all, recognizes the importance of this diversity for food security. Now, the treaty has a series of articles, very legalese language, etc. But one of the more important articles is Article 15, which gives a special place in the treaty to large collections of diversity of crops that have been amassed over the last 30, 40 years by the International Centers for Agricultural Research. These are collections of the major crops that we use around the world. They're the largest, most used, most diverse collections around the world, and they have a sort of special place in the community of gene banks around the world. And they're given pride of place in the treaty, and they're enshrined in this Article 15, which guarantees that there's going to be continued access to this diversity. Unfortunately, what the treaty doesn't do is provide resources to maintain those collections, which is where the Crop Diversity Trust came in. We were set up to raise money to conserve forever crop diversity, starting with these important international collections.
I mean, this, when you mentioned this, you believe this is important. This is, my hope is that everyone will understand its importance, because what we're talking about is the future of food, and what you are focused on doing is ensuring that future exists. So, do these collections then feed into the facility at Svalbard?
What we've realized over the years is that these collections, both the international, the regional, and the national ones, of course, they're maintained as best they can be with the resources available, but sometimes, inevitably, bad things happen to them. The example that is perhaps most saddest is what happened, for example, to the National Gene Bank of the Philippines, which within a span of about 4 years got hit first by a typhoon and then by a fire, which wreaked havoc in the first in the seed store and later during the fire in the what we call the in vitro, the test tube facility where some crops are maintained in test tubes rather than seeds. So these things are inevitable. There's always accidents. There's always both man-made and natural. And we thought that you can mitigate the risk to some extent. You can you make sure that to as far as you can, the risk is as low as possible. But inevitably, things get through. And what we thought is that it would be good for everybody if gene banks around the world could send copies of their collections to a single safe, reliable, cheap place where they could maintain these copies of their holdings, and if something bad happened to their own copies, they could get these back. So in the case of the Philippines, for example, the facility wasn't up and running when the typhoon came, but if it had been, a lot of material that was lost because of the flooding and destruction that occurred would have been saved. So that's the thinking behind this Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Some people think of it as and often in the media it's presented as a sort of a time capsule, which sort of freezes, where you put stuff in and it's frozen and that's it. Although under these conditions in the vault, seeds can last a long time, perhaps up to centuries. All living things eventually die. These conditions delay that, but they don't make these. The cold doesn't make the seeds immortal. So after a while, they will die and they'll have to be replaced. So there'll be a continuous kind of flow over the years, over the decades of material back up to Svalbard, replacing material that over the centuries, over the decades has died, has deteriorated in Svalbard. So it's not as if you send this stuff up there and then forget about it. It's really a network of people working together to ensure that this crop diversity that they're maintaining for future generations will still be there in the time of their children and grandchildren.
Well, and of course, with the latest FAO report on climate change, what we're seeing is that future generations are actually, those generations actually come a lot. Yeah. Food security is something we need to worry about immediately. I really appreciate the clarification because, of course, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault has been described as the Doomsday Vault. Former Executive Director Carrie Fowler described it as a Noah's Ark for seeds. The lengths that we are going to protect our genetic resources seem pretty astonishing, and from what I've read about Svalbard, it's this remote island halfway between mainland Norway and the North Pole, and it sounds like a pretty staggering kind of place, or astonishing place. I wonder if you can take us through the acquisition of materials. How is the material collected? Do you need to verify the sources at all, or do they all come from the major centers? And then what is the process of kind of accepting this material and testing its viability to keep that dynamic flow that you just described going?
So what happens is, let's say you're a gene bank in any country in the world, and you maintain seeds. You're measuring viability. You're ensuring that it's regenerated on a regular basis in order to keep its viability high, etc. So the standard procedure, the standard guidelines that are followed by such gene banks are enshrined in a document by the FAO called the Gene Bank Standards, and the recommendation is that you make a copy of those seeds, and you deposit them in another gene bank somewhere around the world, just in case. The further recommendation, and this was also endorsed by the International Treaty in one of its recent meetings, was that a further copy be made and deposited in Svalbard. To be absolutely certain, this stuff is precious. It's unique. You don't want to take any risks with it. You don't want to take any chances. Once it's gone forever. So we have this two-tier safety duplication recommendation. So if a gene bank has decided it wants to do this, it simply writes to the gene bank in the Nordic countries, which has responsibility for day-to-day management of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is called NordGen. You write to the person in charge. It's a very nice guy called Ola, whom I'm looking forward to seeing again. He used to be a colleague actually at the Global Crop Diversity Trust when we were back in Rome. Looking forward to seeing him again in Svalbard next week. You write to Ola, and he basically organizes it for you. He says, okay, when will the seeds shipment be ready? Maybe you have to go through a process of multiplying the seeds. Maybe you already have it ready, and you exchange emails with Ola, and he's very efficient. So within a short time, he will have set up all the logistics for you, basically. And then you basically prepare your seed shipment. You seal the individual what we call accession, the individual seed samples in special laminated foil bags, properly sealed. Of course, you have to dry the seeds. These are standard gene bank procedures. You dry the seeds to a particular moisture content. You seal them in bags. You put them in a box. The size of the box is specified because it has to fit in the shelving. And then you basically DHL it up to Ola. Who then ensures that it gets up to a place called Longyearbyen, which is kind of the capital of Svalbard, and the airport there is a short drive to the vault. He drives it up there and puts it into the appropriate shelf. You are also asked at the same time to send basic information on each of the samples, what the crop is. When its level of viability, etc. So that there's a record which is entered into a database which you can check online, which has all this information. So at a glance, you know how many seed samples from how many countries and institutes are in Svalbard, and that's it. That your seeds are safe up there. And you're the only one that can, in the future, request those seeds back. So basically, you do not lose any kind of ownership over the seeds.
Would you clear up a few other questions that come up along those lines? Because effectively, one of people's concerns, or this misconception in the media certainly, is that anyone has access to it, and that includes industry, right? People who are working in biotechnology who may want to use this plant material to create different kinds of seeds. And to that end, could you also explain, would Ola accept hybrid seeds or transgenic seeds, which are more commonly known as genetically modified seeds?
No, no. The law on Svalbard is that GMOs are not allowed on its territory. So, and that's made quite clear to anybody who wants to deposit there. But you know, let's go back to who we're targeting here for this kind of support, for this kind of service, really, that Svalbard provided. It's national gene banks around the world. Now, a national gene bank is extremely unlikely to be storing hybrids and GMOs. A national gene bank in Kenya or in Peru or in Vietnam, what they're interested in are the land races of the crops that are important to the country.
Will you explain land races?
Sure. A land race is simply an old traditional variety type of a crop. It's what is often referred to as heirlooms. Sometimes people think in the West that it's only the West that has heirlooms, heirloom apples or tomatoes or something. In fact, every country in the world has its own heirlooms. Some countries more than others, and they're not just of apples or tomatoes. They're also of wheat and maize and barley and beans and cassava and all these other crops, sorghum and millet. All these crops have different variants, different types, different varieties that have been nurtured and developed by farmers over hundreds of years. We call them land races. It's not a particularly nice name, but that's the jargon. Heirlooms is a nicer name.
You mentioned throughout this conversation staple crops, certainly millet, sorghum, cassava, wheat. Is
Sure.
there are there any crops in the collection that are not necessarily staples, but are certainly important crops for many people, such as coffee or cacao?
Okay. There's two questions there, really. Yes, there are crops up there that are not staples. There's plenty of vegetables. There's some wild species, some wild relatives of cultivated crops. The crops you mention are odd in that. See, all this work is predicated on the fact that you can store seeds for a long time if you can dry them and put them in the cold. However, that's not the case for all seeds. So there are some species, some crops, some seeds, which can't take that kind of hammering. That if you dry them and put them in the fridge, they die. And coffee is one of them. We call it recalcitrant. The seeds are not capable of being stored in the same way as tomatoes or wheat or maize. It's only a minority of crops that are like that, but there are some quite important ones. And so the bottom line is that for those recalcitrant seeded crops, you can't put them in Svalbard because they won't last up there. You have to think of other ways of conserving them.
Well, it's humbling to think about all the efforts of scientists and researchers and breeders and farmers all coming together. And I wonder, just to wrap up, if you could tell us, those of us who are not scientists, farmers, breeders, what have you, how can we help encourage biodiversity preservation?
Well, I think the easiest way possibly is to insist that there be more than just one apple in the supermarket. Something as simple as that could have an effect. I mean, if people around the world insist on having a range of options with regard to the food they eat, The farmers will certainly react to that and try to fulfill that need. So, value and treasure diversity in the crops and the livestock breeds that you consume, and insist on having choices. It's not just providing choice to the consumer, but if a farmer has lots of different varieties in his field, in his or her field, if something goes wrong with one of them, they've got something to fall back on. So it's a great insurance policy, diversity, as well as being a great joy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for reminding us of the necessity of diversity in seed, in crops, in livestock, in aquatic life, that also that we all have agency in moving toward the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.